Hey everyone, today I thought we'd look over and rank each year of Dead by Daylight. For this ranking we are going purely off of the content that was released, and content received in those chapters for those years. As always, this is just my opinion. Be sure to drop your own thoughts down below. Let's get into it. Starting off in our last place, we have Year 5. Year 5 was probably one of the rockiest years for Dead by Daylight, with a large fluctuation of consistency when it came to content. Year 5 featured Silent Hill, Descend Beyond, A Binding of Kin, and All Kill. Now, Year 5 I think gets a really bad rap, even though I am still ranking it last. First off, this year started out incredibly well. We got maybe the best licensed chapter that we've ever had, with Silent Hill, featuring The Executioner, Cheryl Mason, and Midwich Elementary. The quality of this chapter was amazing. Pyramid Head had a complex power that was adapted faithfully, Cheryl looked good, and brought some niche, although interesting perks along. Midwich was received poorly, but for me at least, is now a map I enjoy playing on. For such a great start to the year, it's kind of a shame how the rest of the year panned out. Descend Beyond followed Silent Hill. Descend Beyond was a chapter that felt quite lackluster for content, featuring the Blight and Felix Richter, but no new map. We were however receiving map reworks at the time. On release, Blight had a lot of issues with collision in particular, these issues taking a decent amount of time to be ironed out. His power was unique though, and as the years have gone by, Blight has become realized as one of the strongest killers in the game, changing up the meta after a long time of Spirit and Nurse dominance. Felix was kind of interesting as a character, but equally there wasn't much that made him stand out. His backstory was cool and his perks were nothing special. He does seem to have a dedicated player base now though, which is nice. Descend Beyond was followed by possibly one of the worst releases in DBD history, with the A Binding of Kin chapter. This chapter also released without a map. What it did feature was an interesting survivor character, Elodie Rakoto, and the unique but horribly buggy twins. Twins both in the PTB and upon release were rough to play. There was so many issues with them, and in gameplay they just felt very clunky, some of these issues still remaining to this day. To end the year off we had All Kill, another controversial chapter. This chapter was largely controversial for its very bright colours and the focus on K-pop, both of these considered as not tonally fitting for DBD by a fairly large portion of the community. I was pretty okay with it to be honest, and I thought it was the exact thing we needed after the two previous quite dreary looking chapters. The main letdown of this chapter for me was actually Trickster's power. I've never found it interesting then or now. For this year overall, Silent Hill has stood the test of time. The Blight in particular has become one of the strongest killers and had many of his issues ironed out. Twins, although better, are still very clunky, and don't really receive many updates either. Trickster I think I've actually come to dislike more over time. I still like his visuals and design, but his power I find to be very boring and frustrating. A big thing missing this year was maps, having only Midwich added, which in itself was polarizing. The other contender for the worst year of content, I would argue, was Year 2. Year 2 included A Lullaby for the Dark, Leatherface, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Saw. This may initially seem surprising, as this is one of the densest years for licenses, acquiring some of the biggest in horror. However, I would argue the quality of each of these does not nearly make up for the names themselves. In particular, I would argue both A Nightmare on Elm Street and Leatherface were some of the worst chapters, let alone worst licensed chapters. The Leatherface chapter was actually a paragraph, releasing only with him as the killer, no survivor and no map. His power was far more basic on release than it is now, not featuring charges, but a basic singular sweep of the chainsaw. He further had pretty much all of his add-ons and their effects copied from Hillbilly, making him possibly the most uninspired killer upon release in DBD history. Since then, he's been turned around, but still lacks creativity in a lot of ways. He's also managed to become the face of camping. A Nightmare on Elm Street featured a unique but awkward power for Freddy, a Quentin that looked odd. Finally, a not so great map with Badham Preschool. Nowadays, Freddy has a reworked power, which is incredibly weak and also boring. The power itself also feels underwhelming for his character, who's associated with far crazier visuals than splotches of blood on the floor. The positive for Elm Street now is that Quentin did finally get his face rework, and some of his perks aren't too bad either. The saving graces of Year 2 and why it just pulls ahead of Year 5 are both A Lullaby for the Dark and Saw. Saw was a well done licensed chapter overall. The pig introduced an interesting multi-ability power with her reverse bear traps. Both Pig and Tap were adapted very well and have surprisingly decent lore for being licensed. The map Gideon Meat Plant has never been particularly liked and currently has a palette problem. However, it does at least have a unique map layout, as well as an interesting set of visuals going for it, especially after the rework. Lullaby for the Dark introduced David King and the Huntress, two characters who have been fully embraced by the community. David is a popular survivor and brought along possibly the best exhaustion perk, Dead Hard, as well as the heavily memed No Mither. Huntress was and is still a simple character, which truly worked for her benefit. She was a great introduction to ranged killers. She currently sits as the most played killer also, appearing in over 8% of trials, an impressive figure for the 27 killers in the roster. Red Forest was also introduced. This was a nice, cozy feeling realm, but the map of Mother's Dwelling, as the largest in the game, has never been anyone's favourite it seems. Overall, Lullaby and Saw really redeemed this year, and just pull ahead of Year 5 for that reason. In our 4th spot we have Year 3. Year 3 featured Curtain Call, Shattered Bloodline, Darkness Among Us, Demise of the Faithful, and Ash vs Evil Dead. One thing Year 3 excelled at was the visuals of the characters. In this year they introduced a wider range of animations for the characters, and more interesting sounds and themes. Another thing it did well was variety between the killers released. Clown, Spirit, Legion, and Plague, although not perfect, were all pretty unique, and I think are solid characters to be honest. They also laid the groundwork for many other characters to come. The one paragraph of this year was Ash vs Evil Dead. This was a content-lacking paragraph, but cool still to have Ash in the game, particularly with voice lines from Bruce Campbell himself. Metal of Man as a perk also left a brief impression on the meta, before being nerfed into the ground. We also got a pretty good range of original survivors with Kate, Adam, Jeff, and Jane. They're all pretty popular with the player base, and are all very solid as characters, with decent lore. The perks for Year 3, although interesting, felt fairly forgettable for survivors. For maps, Year 3 had two of my favourites with Father Campbell's Chapel and Temple of Purgation, and another two I'm pretty okay with, both Family Residence and Ormond. Year 3 as a whole isn't exactly a year people look to, I don't think, when they think of a good year. I would argue though that this year was actually very solid. I think its lack of anything spectacular is why this year is typically looked at as bad. I would argue otherwise though. Next up we have Year 1. Year 1 featured The Last Breath, Halloween, Of Flesh and Mud, Left Behind, and Spark of Madness. Year 1 as an establishing year was quite impressive to be honest. Nurse as the first chapter was something quite unique, completely breaking the rules of the game, a definite shift from the fairly grounded base original killers. Paired with Nurse as the survivor was Nia becoming a popular character. Protospren was a decent realm when added, although I feel it's never been particularly balanced. The first license ever appeared in Year 1, which was Halloween. Halloween brought a unique experience, and one that really felt like Michael Myers. Laurie didn't look the best, although she certainly shook up the meta, with her two perks, Decisive Strike and Object of Obsession. She also had Soul Survivor, I guess. Haddonfield was the map and has been one of the most problematic maps since its release, only now receiving a rework. For the final two chapters we got two of the most annoying characters to face, with both Hag and Doctor. Hag's positives were probably the introduction of hexes, and also a pretty interesting power to use, although not so much to face. Doctor had some cool new status effects like madness and sounds and stuff, I guess. These two chapters also brought along two fairly disliked Realms, with Backwater Swamp and Larry's Memorial Institute. Swamp on release was particularly bad. Nurse, Hag, and Doctor have all pretty much stood the test of time since release, but also don't feel all that different, and haven't received much in terms of reworks, aside the obvious buffs they've had. Doctor is the only one to receive a proper power overhaul, and is better today because of it. Myers has somewhat suffered from lack of change over the years, becoming one of the weaker killers. He is still fun though, which is good. The maps of this year over time have aged horribly, I feel, being some of the worst currently available. We'll have to see how the Haddonfield rework turns out. Of course, finally in this year we got Bill, a character who has become greatly loved by the community, and partly because of how he's associated with altruism and the perk Borrowed Time. Bill was adapted very well, and even recently was expanded on more with his very own tome. Moving on to our second place, we have Year 6. Year 6 featured Resident Evil, Hellraiser, Hour of the Witch, Portrait of a Murder, and Sadako Rising. This year has been better than I think it's been perceived, to be honest. Comparatively to Year 5, we've had some pretty solid content overall this year. We started off with a big content release with Resident Evil. Ari brought along 2 great survivors with Jill and Leon, with some cool new perks like Flashbang and Blast Mine. Nemesis had great visuals and sounds, but didn't feel all too much like the character, and also had a relatively uninspired power. It was cool to see the introduction of AI with the zombies though. RPD was too big, and still is. Although very detailed, this map is largely hated. Following this was the Hellraiser chapter, featuring only Pinhead, a stark contrast in terms of content. Despite this, Pinhead I think is such a great addition to the game, and the love that was put into crafting his character and power really shows. I wasn't excited really for this chapter, and I had very low expectations, but I think he's one of the cooler killers to be added as of recent, with interesting interactions and cool animations, and generally a more immersed feel with his voice lines. I know that's going to be a bit of a controversial take. I really like him, to be honest. It's a shame there was no survivor or map, but I feel the quality of Pinhead alone was enough. Hellraiser was followed by the Hour of the Witch half chapter, featuring only a survivor, Michaela Reed, this seemingly making up for the lack of survivor with Pinhead. I would argue both of these chapters were great for perks. Michaela brought along a new perk type with boons, and Pinhead brought along Scourge hooks too. Both of these shaking the meta up for the better, I feel. The main letdown of this year, I would say, was the Portrait of a Murder chapter, which was nothing special to me, and potentially one of the more boring and uneventful chapters in recent memory. I was pretty hyped for this chapter initially too. The artist has an interesting design, but a boring anti-loot power, which I don't find particularly fun to face. This chapter seems like it will go down as a fairly forgettable one. However, after a long time of no new original maps, this chapter did bring one along. It was nice to get the new Forsaken Boneyard Realm, but for gameplay, it's not the best, and follows the trend of recent maps being a bit too big. We then of course have Sadako Rising as the final chapter of Year 6. We only have PTB content currently, but I'm really happy with it. There is no new map however, which is always a shame. But both Sadako and Yuichi are very interesting, and are bringing in some pretty game-changing perks. Sadako's power is also very unique, and diverges from the recent trend of anti-loot killers we've been seeing. This chapter and its whole vibe is also pretty scary. Both Sadako and Pinhead have had some of the coolest animations and visuals in the game too. The way they've been adapted, considering the lack of clear powers and such, is very impressive. All in all, I think this year has been great. Undoubtedly the best year of Dead by Daylight to me was Year 4 though. Year 4 featured Ghostface, Curse Legacy, Stranger Things, and Chains of Hate. This year to me featured the perfect combination of chapters. We got 2 amazing original chapters, 1 insanely big license that brought a lot of hype, and finally somewhere in between with a semi-licensed, semi-original chapter. We started off strong with Ghostface, a largely original character, licensed from just the Ghostface mask. This character turned out brilliantly, considering it was just the mask that was licensed. The main downsides of him were his derivative power, and also the bugs on his release were pretty bad. With that said, Ghostface has really found his place within the killer roster, and for me was the first killer I bought and consistently played. This chapter did have a lack of content, featuring no survivor or map. As the license was just the mask though, I think this was fine. It was also fine as Ghostface was followed by the Stranger Things chapter, the most content-packed chapter we've had aside Resident Evil. Steve and Nancy were adapted really well, and and the Demogorgon was a fun addition with a balanced power. Hawkins was a bit hit and miss, but it was a unique map for what it was. This chapter was all around polished and well received, and brought one of the biggest influxes of hype the game has ever seen. Following Stranger Things, we had Curse Legacy. Oni is one of my favorite killers. I love his design, and I think his power is so much fun. Yui was a cool survivor, and brought along some game-changing perks like Any Means Necessary. The letdown of this chapter was probably the map. Sanctum of Wrath is fine, but it's not exactly my favorite map either. Finally, we got another one of the most well-rounded original chapters with Chains of Hate. Deathslinger brought along a literal gun power, which was super cool. Zarina was an interesting and compelling survivor, with fun perks like For the People. Dead Dog was a tonally distinct map with great ambience, and another one of my favorites. Maybe even my favorite. Overall, this year was truly amazing, I think, containing the best content we could have asked for, from both licenses and original chapters, all of it standing the test of time too. Even with Stranger Things now gone, it had a good 2 years, and the chapter's content still lives on as some of the best. R.I.P. Hawkins. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to drop your own thoughts on this, or favourite year, down below. Thanks, and goodbye.